All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Frank Howe. I'm with the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources. I'm their university liaison, both to USU and BYU and all the other colleges in the state, actually. And I'll be the moderator this afternoon. And our first speaker this afternoon is Marty Vavra with USDA Forest Service, the Pacific Northwest Research Station in La Grande. Marty has almost 4 decades of experience in range livestock grazing systems, livestock and wildlife relationships and ungulate ecology in Eastern Oregon. He's a former professor in ranger and resources and superintendent of the Eastern Oregon Agricultural Research Center. And he's also the current rangeland scientist and leader of the Starkey Ungulate ecology team, Pacific Northwest Research Station. And without any further ado, I would ask you to please help me welcome Marty Vavra.
Thank you. Okay. The first thing I want to do is recognize all the research partners that are kind of in our ungulate working group in Northeast Oregon, and any one of these people could be up here today giving this presentation. So, ungulate herbivory is a chronic disturbance. You know, ungulate herbivory has been on our minds, and we've studied it for at least 20 years. Okay, there's a lot of research papers on it, and there is still recent papers. I just pulled this out of the 2010 literature, and I might also add that it's very much an international problem. We don't ever want to think it's just here in the West that ungulate herbivory is an issue of concern. The first one, browsing by free-living ungulates is a serious threat to forest regeneration. That comes from a paper focused in Germany. In the next paper, white-tailed deer browsing has altered plant species diversity throughout the deciduous forest understories in eastern North America. And finally, the decrease in active forest management and increases in browsing pressure were involved in the loss of species from the field layer, which is the understory. That comes from Great Britain. So, ungulate herbivory continues to be a major international issue, and one that we spend a lot of time and effort on. Kind of some of the problems are the way we spend our time. Here's what we do. We go out there and we have a disturbance and we build a fence. And we come back a few years later and go, whoa, that's kind of interesting, you know? And that's what we do. And so, you know, there are lots of examples of these kind of things going on in the western U.S. But in a review paper that Mike Wisdom and some others did a couple years ago that I was involved in, we found out that, yes, in fact, this is kind of what we do. We either look at total exclusion versus extant grazing, whatever it may be, cattle, deer, and elk. Sometimes we put up in a second fence to give us a third treatment that excludes livestock so we can see what deer and elk have done. But we really don't ever look at manipulative studies to look at different stocking rates of deer, elk, or cattle, or the combination of effects between the chronic disturbance of herbivory that occurs after an episodic disturbance event like fire. So we've been really missing the boat on really how to resolve the issue. So Hobbs in his 1996 Journal of Wildlife Management paper summed it all up. You know, ungulates can impact the nitrogen cycle, net primary production, as Terry mentioned this morning, either increase it or decrease it. They can change fire regimes from understory burns to crown fires. They can create spatial heterogeneity because they are uneven in the way they graze landscapes. And they can certainly modulate successional process and control switching between alternative states, as we've seen in the 2 previous slides. And just a little bit more of that, looking at yet another exposure in terms of nitrogen cycles. 2 things in northeastern Oregon that are important to us in our forest in terms of forest productivity are limiting factors of nitrogen, soil nitrogen available, and moisture. Okay? And certainly after an episodic event like fire, we get a release in ceanothus species, like you see here, inside this exposure. They're nitrogen-fixing plants, and over the long term, they will provide nitrogen as succession proceeds. But you can see in this slide that Ungulate herbivory has pretty much removed that nitrogen-fixing plant from the understory. So perhaps a long-term decline in forest productivity on this site because of ungulate grazing. And certainly livestock grazing has played a role in this in the long run and in historic sense, because we had almost total removal of the understory. We were not able to carry ground fires at that time because there are no fine fuels. At the same time we removed those fine fuels, we removed the competitive ability of that herbaceous and shrub understory to compete with emerging conifer seedlings. So we saw a heck of a lot of forest ingrowth that created ladder fuels that led to crown fires that got us into the big fire business that we're into today, and the problem with fuels. But anytime we've looked at ungulate herbivory in the past and problems on forest lands, rangelands, send in the cows, blame them. The cows have always been to blame, and certainly from a historic standpoint, they have played a very negative role in the condition of a lot of our rangelands. No doubt about it. But today, with our current management systems, we should be able to get a handle on livestock grazing in all cases except around riparian zones. That remains a critical factor we still need to work on. So, what about these people, these guys? They evolved out there with this vegetation. They should be benign. You can hear people say that. And certainly, before the coming of European peoples to the western United States, they might have had less of an impact because they had more complete habitats. The southern Yellowstone elk herd did not spend the winter in Jackson Hole. They migrated up over Hoback Junction and Pinedale and out into the Red Desert, and they were able to go anywhere they wanted to. What they did back then is they had a feeding patch probably, and they went out there and they took off the best, most highly nutritious forage that was there, and they were able to move on. Now they had to worry about predators, granted, four-legged and two-legged at the time. But again, they had freedom of movement. And that's something that we have taken away from them. Some things that really hurt us today in terms of trying to manage ungulates are legacy effects from historic livestock grazing that was abusive. We've lost soils, we've lost plant communities, and we're dealing in some cases with rangelands, forest lands that are less productive than they used to be because of this past abusive grazing. We've converted a lot of land, winter range in this case, and made it perhaps unavailable, or at least restricted availability, we think. But yet we find, this is the Grand Ronde Valley in northeast Oregon, and we find we have deer and elk that use farm ground for summer range and move to native range in the wintertime. We have elk and deer that use native range in the summertime and move to the farm ground in the winter. And we have some deer and elk that just stay on the farm ground year-round. So when we develop, wildlife management plans, we really want to think about alfalfa fields and things like that sometimes in terms of habitat component. The other thing we brought with us, besides this exotic invader called the cow, are a bunch of plants, either because we liked them or we brought them in by accident. In this case, it's Potentilla erecta that's converted this rangeland to a near monoculture. And the interesting thing about Potentilla erecta here, it's a good example. A really neat ecological adaptation that plants have is to be able to, one, attach to an animal's hide and be carried around and disperse seed, or be eaten by the animal, go through the digestive tract, and end up in an elk pile or a deer pile of feces and germinate and spread the seed. It's called epizoochory and endozoochory. These were great ecological adaptations until invasive plants came along and we started transporting exotic invaders came along and we started transporting them all over the landscape. And Potentilla erecta is a great example. We've studied it. In Potentilla erecta, the seeds just fall, boom, right there next to the plant. However, deer and elk consume the seed heads in the winter when there's snow on the ground. They pass through the digestive tract And when you find new patches of Potentilla erecta out on the rangelands, it's about that big around because it comes from a pile of manure and it's had a great place to germinate with all that nitrogen. So a neat little ecological adaptation that plants had has turned into one of our biggest enemies in terms of the spread of exotic invaders. The other thing that we've done, as I mentioned, livestock grazing consumed a lot of fine fuels. That coupled with fire suppression, we've ended up with an invasive native species like juniper. And as we develop this overstory of juniper, we have decreased the amount of understory available, as you all know. And the same thing has happened on our forest lands with fire suppression and livestock grazing and ingrowth of species growing outside. Oftentimes we'll have Douglas fir and grand fir growing on sites that previously had a very open canopy of ponderosa pine. In the early 1990s, late 1980s, along came a series of drought years. With those drought years came the spruce budworm, and a lot of our grand fir and Douglas fir died at that point in time, so our forests look like this, all set up for some pretty heavy-duty conflagrations, which have occurred. Okay, the other thing that we don't have these days in much of the western United States on public lands is a thing called transitory range. Okay, and this is also an early successional habitat. When we were actively logging, we were making food for cattle, deer, and elk. And if you're in eastern Oregon, after you do a logging show about like this, you've got about 20 years of good understory growth there that'll provide forage for those animals. You get over to the best sites in western Oregon where they restock with trees, and you can lose that transitory range in as little as 5 years. And if you go over to western Oregon on Forest Service lands right now with the cessation of logging due to the spotted owl issues, you find that the Forest Service and Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation spend a lot of money on these little meadow patches that are over there that are getting beat really hard by elk, and they try to rehab them constantly to keep down the blackberry invasion and that sort of thing. The other thing you see is a real concentration of elk on power line right-of-ways. You do a telemetry study and you relocate elk over there and put little dots on a nice GIS, and you have a straight line of elk relocations. So that's the other thing we've done at this point in time. We've removed a whole bunch of foraging habitat from these animals. And this is kind of what it looked like from the air. And, you know, that's not really aesthetically pleasing from the air, but it's not really that bad when you look at, you know, you've got cover connectivity here for security cover between those forage availability. Those are small clear cuts. They're made so you maximize edge. And if you look real close, some of them are already into succession, so the timing has been varied out there. And that was a good way to provide a forage base for ungulates. Okay, with the cessation of logging and the increase in fuels we've got, as I mentioned earlier, things kind of get taken care of because we now have wildfires that have replaced this. The problem is we're seeing 100,000 acre and larger stand replacement burns with a tremendous, no edge effect whatsoever here. Oftentimes we'll maintain roads out in those burns and traffic. More on that later, and effectively negate that habitat, at least to elk. The other thing we do is herbivore management. This is a burn down in southeastern Oregon, right on the forest fringe. It's ponderosa pine bunchgrass range, kind of dry. There's not enough snow there to mash down that litter every year. So that blue bunch wheatgrass in there has got 2 to 3 years of standing litter in there with it, and there's no way an elk is going to root through all that and try to find the green parts in there. It's herbivore proof at this point in time. Okay, so that's going to put more pressure on the forbs, any emerging deciduous shrubs that are out there. So we're changing the food habits of those animals through our management in many cases. Okay, the other thing that we do when we have logged in the past, and I talked about how wonderful transitory range was in logging. Well, we built a lot of roads, and we made the mistake of leaving those roads open. And research from the Starkey Experimental Forest indicates that elk have a real aversion to traffic. You can have roads out there as long as they're closed and there's no people on them. But if you run vehicles over those roads, you're going to move elk away from those roads. And we've also done work with ATVs, and if you do work with if you have ATVs on those trails and things, you're going to move elk. So this is a representation of distance bands on an affected habitat loss with a road system that can occur. And so if you're a manager developing a carrying capacity for this entire landscape and don't consider the fact that none of this is really available elk habitat and all the elk are going to be concentrated in this half, then you're going to overstock your range. And that's one problem we've had with a lot of our forest management is human disturbance in the fact that we have compressed this habitat. So where an elk, as I mentioned earlier, had an opportunity to move every time the forage became somewhat limited or not to their liking. Okay? So now forage is not the primary concern for elk, but perhaps security. So they're going to stay in a secure habitat like this one over here and overgraze it, overutilize it. Okay, I really get a kick out of coming over here into the Rocky Mountain States. People talk about aspen forests. Well, this is a really big Eastern Oregon aspen forest. And the only time we have aspen are wet spot seeps and along riparian stringers, and which makes them extremely susceptible to herbivory, given our situations today out there. And the only good part about that, of having small aspen communities, you can learn from our little exposure slides at the beginning and fence them all. And this is how we manage aspen in Eastern Oregon. The only way we can retain that genetic material of aspen in those clones is to build a fence around it right now. Aspen gets all the press, but think about all the other deciduous trees and shrubs out there that are in the same boat. You know, and we've got Rocky Mountain maple, serviceberry, mountain ash, bitter cherry, choke cherry, bitter brush, mountain mahogany, and others that are in the same boat at aspen, and they are disappearing. They're good to eat by all the ungulates, and they are being eaten. So aspen is not the only one. It just gets all the press. Okay, the other thing that we really like to do is classify vegetation as ecologists. Potential natural vegetation, potential vegetation type, plant association group, habitat, whatever you want to call it. But all the work we've done, usually we identify a habitat type or a plant association group. It has some unknown level of background herbivory. And I challenge ecologists that in many cases we can go out, you can identify a habitat type, I can build a fence around it, and 10 years later it'll be a different habitat type because that background herbivory has been removed. And this is a late successional mixed conifer forest, northeast Oregon, that has had that done to it and has expressed a tremendous amount of deciduous material in the understory. And I can point you to a great publication by Bob Riggs and others called Modification of Mixed Conifer Forest by Ruminant Herbivores in the Blue Mountains Ecological Province. It has a lot of pictures in it and a good discussion on this topic. It's in the Starkey website or on the PNW website as a PDF, and you can see me afterwards if you're interested in it. Okay, what about management considerations when we're talking about herbivory? Well, certainly succession, as I've already mentioned, considering transitory ranges, developing a food base, and recognizing that ungulates need in coniferous forests in early successional stages. You have to have an understory that is expressing itself, and that means you've got to take out most of the conifers most of the time. Scale, we've got to look at scale and how people think about scale. You know, the livestock producer, he looks at the ranch scale or maybe his own allotment out on the forest. Wildlife agencies look at management units, and sometimes management units kind of were developed with a specific herd in mind, but more than likely the geographic boundaries on this management unit are roads and ridge tops that hunters can figure out because we make them hunt in one management unit, perhaps for the limited number of cow tags or something like that. Then a federal agency, well, we've done a little bit of regional work, Columbia Basin Project, if you remember, and we work at the watershed or sub-watershed scale. So our different agencies, different entities, are working at different scales. And we need to think landscapes and look at disturbance on those landscapes or surrogates, and getting back up into the succession aspect. Livestock graze on all our public lands and are generally ignored as a tool. They're just kind of out there. You know, we worry about the riparian situation in some cases. But gosh, you know, Leopold first recognized the fact you could use livestock as a tool. We don't really do much about that. There's been some research done on managing vegetation with livestock, but we missed that boat on our public lands in general. And finally, the last one is one that as a research scientist, I'm not even supposed to deal with. I'm supposed to, you know, provide information to managers so they can make good decisions. And policy and management are really the issue. And it's goals. You know, the private sector, be it a livestock rancher or a timber operator, they've got different goals for their land. Certainly the state wildlife agencies have a set of goals for animal management objectives. The federal lands, Forest Service, you know, at one time in our planning, we had key species out there. We geared our management to elk and pileated woodpeckers in northeastern Oregon. Today, our forest plans are geared toward salmon, steelhead, marbled murrelets, spotted owls, and every once in a while lynx. Okay, and it has nothing to do with ungulate management. The public comes along, and the public varies from total preservation, get the people off the land, leave it all natural, don't touch it, to we want a deer and elk behind every tree so we can kill them, to I have a right to drive my ATV on every acre of this public land. And you know, we're not very close in kind of meshing those goals and trying to figure out how we're going to manage our landscapes. And that's probably the biggest limiting factor to ever figuring out issues with ungulates, is this lack of goal setting that's somewhat common. Okay, but just to wrap things up a little bit, on Starkey, I was really hoping to bring some data with me, but we're still working on it. We have got a study that was initiated in 2000, and we did 2,000 acres of fuels reduction at that time. It was a mechanical fuels reduction followed by a prescribed fire. We had about 70 tons of down dead wood per acre on our heaviest fuel locations. We took it down to 10, and then we burned it. And then we took several of these locations and several of the controls, put game-proof fences around 15 acres, and developed ungulate paddocks where we look at 3 levels of grazing of elk, 3 levels of grazing of cattle, and total exclusion. So we're trying to get a handle on the degree of ungulate herbivory that will impact the deciduous component out there primarily, and also perhaps lead to an increase in exotic invaders occurring. We were totally amazed at what has happened. This is a Grandver site that had been mechanically fueled reduced and prescribed burned. That's an aspen tree, the first one we have ever seen on Starkey. It's in a moderate cattle grazing pasture, and we see several aspens. And not only that, whoops, wrong way here. Cottonwoods, willows as well. So we have a whole deciduous component developing under our different grazing strategies up there. And our whole goal is, are there thresholds we can deal with here in terms of ungulate density and timing of grazing here, so that we can develop this kind of understory in the future. So hopefully data will be forthcoming from our study. Okay, as I mentioned, transitory range was pretty important. And we really thought, I always thought this looked pretty darn good. This is on Starkey as well, and it's in a part of Starkey that Kelly Stewart had in her poster, I believe, Kelly, in the Northeast. Yeah. And so this is what it looked like right after it was logged. I always thought this was really great looking stuff. But then I went up on the forest to an evaluation plantation of 20 acres that had been cut and game-proof fenced, and it was going to be stocked with trees in an evaluation plantation. This was done way back in the 80s. It never got planted. It just got left. And it looks like this. You know, that's an entirely different landscape. And that's what you can get on our more productive sites in Northeast Oregon with this exclusion of all the ungulates. Just an amazing difference. And talk about biodiversity, habitat for neotropical migrants and that sort of thing. That's really great. However, I don't want you to think that I'm an anti-ungulate person and, you know, I want to turn the western U.S. into a giant botanical garden. Okay? The whole point for me to try to develop an understory component with deciduous shrubs, deciduous trees, they're palatable, they're food. And late summer is an extremely important time frame for elk and deer. They're fall breeders. You have them in a positive plane of nutrition, you're going to increase their productivity. Okay, and the same works for livestock. So I'd kind of like to figure out how we can have our cake and eat it too, where we can develop a more diverse understory and at the same time provide food for these animals, improve their productivity, improve their winter survival, and that sort of thing. And with that, I think I'm out of time.